I still remember the morning I found out my daughter had gotten married, not from a phone call, not from a trembling confession or a shy invitation, but from a smiling stranger's post that appeared on my screen while I was drinking my tea alone at the kitchen table, and for a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me because there she was in white, laughing, holding a man I had never met, surrounded by people I didn't recognize, and the caption said, "Best day of my life." While my name was nowhere to be found, and in that instant something inside my chest went quiet in a way I can't fully explain, because it wasn't loud pain or anger. It was a deep, hollow silence, the kind that comes when you realize you were already erased before you even knew it was happening. And as I scrolled through photo after photo, I remembered all the nights I stayed awake worrying about her, all the sacrifices I made after her father died, all the years I paid the mortgage alone on the house I bought in her name so she would always have security. The house she lived in rent, free while telling people she was independent. The same house where she stopped answering my calls, stopped visiting, stopped asking how I was, and told me she was too busy. Whenever I tried to talk about our distance, and suddenly those wedding photos felt less like a celebration and more like a confirmation of what I had been refusing to admit, that I had been kept on the outside of her life on purpose, not because she forgot me, but because it was easier to move forward without the weight of gratitude, and that realization hurt more than the loneliness ever did, because loneliness at least leaves room for hope. But this was final, deliberate, and clean, and after I closed my phone, I sat there for hours thinking about the house, about how I was still paying taxes and repairs on a place where my presence was no longer welcome, about how she never once asked if I was okay after my surgery, about how she never invited me for holidays anymore, and I realized that love without respect slowly turns into self-betrayal, and that afternoon I made a decision that took me months to fully understand, but only seconds to feel was right, because the house was never meant to be a reward for silence or neglect. It was meant to be a foundation for family, and since family had been redefined without me, I had every right to redefine my boundaries too. So I contacted a lawyer, sold the house quietly, legally, and fairly, and when the papers were signed, I didn't feel revenge or triumph. I felt relief, like I had finally set down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for years. And when my daughter finally called me furious, confused, demanding explanations, I listened calmly as she shouted about betrayal and embarrassment, and how I had ruined her future. And when she finally paused, waiting for me to defend myself, I told her the truth in a voice that surprised even me, that I didn't sell the house because she got married without me. I sold it because I realized I had been living as an afterthought in her life while funding her comfort, and I told her that love is not proven by how much you give, but by how much you are allowed to matter, and that day I chose to matter to myself, and there was silence on the other end of the line, the same silence I had felt that morning, only this time it wasn't hollow. It was steady, grounded, and when the call ended, I didn't cry, I didn't celebrate. I simply stood by the window, watching the light change, knowing that sometimes the hardest part of being a parent isn't letting go of your child, but letting go of the version of yourself that believed endurance was the same thing as love. After that call ended, days passed in a strange quiet that felt unfamiliar yet honest. And in that stillness, I began to confront the parts of myself I had ignored for years, the parts that mistook sacrifice for connection and silence for peace. And I realized how deeply I had trained myself to accept crumbs of affection because I believed a parent's love should never come with conditions, even if it slowly erased the parent in the process. And as I sorted through old paperwork and boxes while preparing to downsize, I found photos of my daughter as a child, missing teeth smiles, school plays where she searched the crowd until she spotted me, handwritten notes that said, "Love you, Mama," in uneven letters, and those memories didn't break me the way I expected. Instead, they reminded me that love had once been mutual, present, alive, and that what hurt wasn't the loss of her, but the loss of honesty between us. And when news of the house sale spread through family, opinions came quickly and loudly, some saying I was cruel, others quietly admitting they understood, and I listened to all of it without defending myself, because for the first time I wasn't making a decision to be understood. I was making one to survive with dignity. And then one evening my daughter showed up at my door unannounced, her eyes swollen, anger replaced by something closer to confusion. And she asked why I hadn't told her how lonely I was, why I hadn't said I was hurting, and that question almost undid me because it revealed the distance we had both helped create, her by pulling away, and me by staying silent out of fear of being a burden. And I told her the truth slowly, that I had tried, but every unanswered call taught me to stop asking, every dismissed feeling taught me to shrink, and that parents aren't immune to abandonment just because they are older. And as she cried, I saw not a wife or an adult stranger, but the same child who once needed reassurance, and yet I also knew that seeing her pain didn't mean I needed to undo my boundaries, and I explained that selling the house wasn't punishment, it was clarity, that love must include responsibility on both sides, and that independence doesn't mean severing empathy. And when she left that night, nothing was magically fixed, but something honest had finally been spoken. And in the weeks that followed, I moved into a smaller place, started walking every morning, met neighbors who knew nothing of my past sacrifices. And for the first time in years, my life didn't revolve around waiting to be needed, and my daughter began calling occasionally, awkwardly, without demands, just updates. And I learned to accept those calls without expectation, understanding that rebuilding trust is slower than breaking it, and maybe it would never return to what it once was, but I no longer needed it to define my worth, because sometimes the second chapter of motherhood isn't about giving more. It's about finally choosing yourself without guilt, and learning that doing so doesn't mean you loved any less. It means you finally loved wisely. As time continued to pass, the shape of my days changed in ways I never anticipated, and with that change came a deeper understanding of what I had been carrying all along, because once the noise of conflict faded, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly, and they told a story I had ignored for decades, a story of a woman who learned early that being needed felt safer than being seen, and motherhood had only reinforced that belief. So I began doing things that felt unfamiliar at first, like saying no without explaining myself, resting without apologizing, spending money on myself without calculating how it might benefit someone else. And each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had given away out of habit rather than choice. And during one of my morning walks, I ran into an old friend who asked how my daughter was. And for the first time, I answered honestly instead of performing reassurance. I said we were learning each other again, and those words stayed with me because they acknowledged effort without pretending resolution. And weeks later, my daughter invited me for coffee, just the two of us, no dramatic speeches, no accusations, just tentative conversation, and she admitted that she had hidden her wedding not out of cruelty but fear. Fear that I would disapprove, fear that she couldn't live up to the expectations she imagined I held, and hearing that broke something open inside me, because I realized how often silence allows assumptions to grow unchecked until they harden into walls. And I told her that my disappointment wasn't about her choices. It was about being excluded from her truth, and that love doesn't require agreement, only inclusion. And as we talked, I saw how both of us had been acting from fear rather than intention, her fear of judgment, my fear of rejection, and neither of us had stopped to ask what the other actually needed. And still, even in that moment of connection, I didn't regret selling the house because it had forced this honesty to surface, and without it, we might have continued our polite distance forever, mistaking avoidance for peace. And as months went by, our relationship settled into something new, less dependent, more deliberate, built on choice rather than obligation. And I began volunteering at a community center, listening to stories from people whose lives had been fractured by boundaries they never learned to set, and I recognized myself in their words, and each story reminded me that love becomes healthier when it is balanced by self-respect. And though my daughter and I were still healing, I no longer felt invisible in my own life because I had finally learned that being a good parent doesn't mean being endlessly available. It means modeling how to live whole, honest, and unafraid to take up space, even when it's uncomfortable, and that lesson, learned late, was still worth everything. By the time the 4th season since the wedding arrived, I noticed that the sharpness of the pain had softened into something more reflective, like an old ache that no longer demanded attention but still reminded me to move carefully. And in that space, I began to understand how deeply generational patterns shape the way we love, because I had been raised To believe that a mother's role was to endure quietly, to give endlessly, to never ask for reassurance, and without realizing it, I had passed that unspoken lesson on to my daughter, teaching her that my presence was constant and unconditional to the point of invisibility. And once I saw that, I stopped framing our story as one of betrayal and started seeing it as two women trying to survive the roles they were taught. And this shift didn't excuse the hurt, but it gave it context, and context has a way of loosening resentment. And during a family gathering months later, my daughter introduced me to her husband properly for the first time, and while the moment felt awkward, it also felt grounding because there was no performance, no forced closeness, just cautious politeness and an unspoken agreement to move forward without pretending the past didn't exist. And later that evening, as I watched her laugh across the room, I realized that loving her no longer meant centering her life around mine or mine around hers. It meant allowing space for difference without interpreting it as abandonment. And in that realization, I felt something close to peace, because I was no longer measuring our relationship by how much access I had, but by how honest we could be when we did connect. And in the quieter moments of my own life, I continued building routines that belonged only to me, reading in the afternoons, cooking meals I enjoyed instead of what others preferred, making plans without waiting to be invited, and each of these choices reinforced the idea that my worth didn't depend on my usefulness. And strangely, as I became more grounded, my daughter seemed more at ease around me, perhaps sensing that my presence no longer came with expectations she felt unable to meet. And one day she admitted that the house had always made her feel indebted rather than secure, that it reminded her daily of what she hadn't earned and what she feared she might lose. And hearing that confirmed what I had slowly come to understand, that generosity without boundaries can unintentionally create distance instead of closeness. And as we spoke, there was no argument, just mutual recognition of how love can miss its mark even when intentions are good. And while our relationship would never return to its earlier shape, I no longer wanted it to, because this version, imperfect and honest, allowed us both to breathe. And I learned that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step back, not in bitterness, but in trust, trusting that letting go of control can make room for respect, and that releasing what you once gave freely doesn't erase the love behind it, it simply transforms it into something sustainable, something that doesn't require silence or sacrifice to survive. As the years unfolded further, I found myself no longer marking time by what I had lost, but by what I had gained in clarity, and that shift changed everything, because when you stop centering your life around disappointment, you finally have room to notice growth, both your own and others, and I began to see my daughter not as the child who hurt me or the adult who excluded me, but as a woman learning to balance independence with connection, just as I was learning to balance love with self-respect. And our conversations slowly deepened, not in frequency, but in honesty, because neither of us was performing anymore. And there were moments when she apologized quietly, not in grand speeches, but in small acknowledgments, like admitting she should have told me about the wedding earlier, or recognizing that my silence had been mistaken for strength. And I accepted those moments without demanding more, because healing doesn't require complete agreement, only sincere effort. And I noticed that when I stopped rescuing, fixing, or over-explaining, my daughter stepped closer on her own, and that taught me a lesson I wish I had learned sooner, that autonomy invites respect far more than sacrifice ever does. And in my own life, I continued building stability on my own terms, traveling modestly, nurturing friendships I had neglected, and discovering joy in routines that once felt mundane. And I realized that the house I sold had represented more than property. It had represented a version of motherhood built on quiet endurance, and letting it go symbolized my willingness to release that role without guilt. And one afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I came across an image of myself from years ago, tired, smiling out of obligation, and I felt compassion instead of judgment, because she did what she knew how to do with the tools she had, and that compassion extended outward too, because I stopped expecting perfection from my daughter. Understanding that love between adults is negotiated, not assumed, and as our relationship settled into something steadier, I understood that reconciliation doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like mutual respect from a comfortable distance, and that is still a form of love. When people asked if I regretted selling the house, I answered honestly that I regretted the years I believed love required me to disappear, but I didn't regret the decision that finally allowed me to reappear in my own life, and that truth, once acknowledged, brought me a sense of peace that no property or approval ever could, because I had learned that being a mother does not end when you stop giving everything. It evolves into something quieter, wiser, and far more sustainable, rooted not in obligation, but in choice. As I moved deeper into this new chapter of my life, I began to notice how differently I carried myself, how my shoulders no longer felt weighed down by unspoken expectations, and how my thoughts were no longer dominated by what I owed others, because somewhere along the way I had learned that love to survive must be allowed to breathe, and this understanding slowly reshaped my relationship with my daughter in ways that felt more real than anything we had shared in years. Because now when we spoke, it was not out of duty or obligation, but choice, and that choice carried a quiet sincerity that felt stronger than constant closeness ever had, and I saw how she too was changing, becoming more reflective, more open about her struggles, less defensive, and one evening she admitted that she had spent years trying to prove she didn't need anyone, not realizing how deeply that need to appear strong had isolated her, and hearing that reminded me of myself at her age, equally determined, equally afraid of appearing dependent, and in that recognition I felt empathy instead of resentment, and as our conversations unfolded without urgency, I understood that healing between adults happens not through control or sacrifice, but through patience and mutual accountability, and in my own solitude I found strength I once believed only existed in service to others, strength in waking up without resentment, in planning my days around my own needs, in feeling complete without explanation, and I realized that the most profound change wasn't in my relationship with my daughter, but in my relationship with myself, because I no longer measured my worth by how much I gave or how little I asked for. And when my daughter spoke about her future plans, children perhaps, uncertainty, fears she never voiced before, I listened without advice, without rescue, simply present, and that presence felt more valuable than any house I could have provided. And I understood then that selling the house had not closed a door, it had opened a different one where love was no longer tied to control or sacrifice, but to respect, honesty, and the courage to let relationships evolve. Even when that evolution feels uncomfortable, and as I looked ahead, I felt no bitterness, no longing to reclaim the past, only a grounded acceptance that sometimes the most loving act a parent can take is to step back, stand firm in their own dignity, and trust that love, when given space, will find its way into a healthier form. As this 7th chapter unfolded, I became increasingly aware that healing does not announce itself with dramatic moments, but with subtle shifts that only make sense in hindsight, like the way my daughter now asked how I was and waited for the answer, or how I no longer felt the urge to soften my truth to protect her comfort, and those small changes told me more than apologies ever could, because they showed growth rather than guilt, and I realized that both of us were learning something essential very late in life, that love without honesty creates distance, and honesty without cruelty creates room to return, and I found myself reflecting often on the woman I had been before the wedding photos appeared on my screen, how tightly I clung to the idea that being a good mother meant being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly silent, and how that belief slowly turned me into someone who existed only on the edges of her own life, and letting go of that identity felt like grief at first, because even unhealthy roles can feel familiar, but over time that grief transformed into relief, because I no longer woke up bracing myself for disappointment or rejection. And when my daughter invited me to a small family dinner one evening, nothing grand or symbolic, just an ordinary gathering, I accepted without anxiety, without rehearsing expectations, and I noticed how different it felt to simply be present rather than hopeful, and as we sat at the table, I listened more than I spoke, and I saw her glance at me now and then with a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before, as if she finally understood that my love was not indestructible, but human, and that understanding, though painful, brought us closer in a way indulgence never did, and later, driving home alone, I realized that this was the quiet reward of choosing myself, not distance, but balance, not punishment, but clarity, and I understood that selling the house had never been about money or control. It had been about reclaiming my voice, and once reclaimed, it allowed my relationships to reorganize themselves more honestly, and as I looked ahead to the years still waiting for me, I no longer feared loneliness, because solitude had taught me who I was beyond my roles, and I no longer feared losing my daughter, because I had learned that love does not disappear when you stop overgiving, it matures, and in that maturity I found something I never expected: peace without bitterness, connection without dependence, and the quiet confidence that I could love deeply without losing myself ever again. As time continued its steady movement forward, I began to understand that this entire journey had not been about loss or punishment, but about awakening, because the pain that once felt unbearable had slowly transformed into wisdom that guided my choices with calm certainty, and I noticed how naturally my life now flowed without the constant undercurrent of guilt, because I had finally released the belief that my worth was tied to how much I sacrificed, and this inner shift reflected outward in ways I hadn't anticipated, in how my daughter approached me with more openness, in how our conversations carried less tension and more sincerity, and in how I no longer felt the need to prove my love through material support or endless availability. And one afternoon while walking alone, I thought about the moment I first saw those wedding photos online, how sharp and isolating that pain had been, and I realized that if that moment hadn't forced me to confront the imbalance in our relationship, I might still be living quietly resentful, mistaking endurance for love, and that realization filled me with gratitude rather than regret, because growth often arrives disguised as heartbreak, and as my daughter and I continued to rebuild our connection slowly, imperfectly, I understood that reconciliation does not require returning to the past. It requires creating a future where both people can stand whole, and I learned to appreciate the relationship we had now for what it was, not mourning what it wasn't, because comparison only robs the present of its value, and I saw how my daughter had begun to carry herself differently too, more mindful of the impact of her choices, more aware that independence does not mean emotional distance. And while we would never erase the hurt that brought us here, we had learned how to live beyond it, and in that space I found a deeper form of love, one not fueled by obligation or fear, but by mutual respect, and I came to understand that selling the house was not an act of rejection, it was an act of self-preservation, and that preserving myself allowed me to love more honestly, more sustainably, and as I looked ahead to the rest of my life, I felt grounded in a truth that would stay with me always, that love flourishes not when we give everything away, but when we give from a place of wholeness, and that choosing yourself does not diminish the love you have for others. It teaches them how to love you back. As this 9th chapter settled into place, I realized that the quiet strength I had gained was something I carried effortlessly now, no longer something I had to remind myself of, and that strength showed itself in the simplest ways, in how I responded rather than reacted, in how I listened without absorbing blame, and in how I allowed relationships to unfold without forcing outcomes. And I noticed that my daughter, too, had stopped testing boundaries and started respecting them. Not because she feared losing me, but because she finally understood that my boundaries were not walls. They were expressions of self-respect, and that understanding created a safer space between us than indulgence ever had. And there were moments when she would casually mention the house, not with anger anymore, but with reflection, acknowledging that she had taken my sacrifices for granted, and I accepted those acknowledgments without revisiting the pain, because growth does not require reliving the wound, only recognizing it. And I thought often about how differently our story might have unfolded if I had learned earlier that love should not come at the cost of self-erasure, but perhaps learning it later made the lesson deeper, more permanent, because it was earned through experience rather than advice. And in my own life, I continued nurturing peace through routine and intention, filling my days with things that brought quiet joy rather than validation. And I understood that fulfillment does not always come from closeness. Sometimes it comes from alignment, from living in a way that honors your values without resentment. And as I reflected on motherhood now, I saw it less as a role and more as a relationship, one that evolves, challenges, and requires honesty from both sides, and I no longer measured my success as a mother by how much I gave, but by how well I modeled self-respect, emotional accountability, and resilience. And in that reframing, I felt proud, not of sacrifice, but of growth, because I had learned that love does not demand you disappear. It invites you to stand fully present, and when you do, the right people learn how to meet you there. As this final chapter unfolded, I understood that the story had never truly been about a wedding I wasn't invited to or a house I chose to sell. It had been about reclaiming my place in my own life after years of quietly stepping aside, and that realization brought a peace so steady it no longer needed reassurance, because I had learned to trust myself, my instincts, and my right to exist beyond the roles I once defined myself by. And when I looked at my daughter now, I saw not the pain that once separated us, but the growth that hardship had forced into the open. And though our relationship would always carry the memory of that turning point, it no longer defined us. It simply reminded us of how fragile connection can be when honesty is absent, and how resilient it can become once truth is allowed in. And I no longer wished for the past to be different, because changing it would erase the clarity I now lived with, and instead I carried gratitude for the lesson that taught me the difference between love and self-neglect, between generosity and silence, and between endurance and dignity. And as I moved forward into the rest of my life, I did so without bitterness, without the need for validation, and without fear of being forgotten, because I had learned that my worth does not depend on inclusion in someone else's milestones, but on how fully I honor my own existence. And in that understanding, I found freedom, the kind that comes not from walking away in anger, but from standing still in truth, knowing that choosing yourself is not the end of love. It is often the beginning of a healthier one.